our communication panel. Are we all here? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished authorities and representatives of the energy sector of the region. In the name of the Latin American Organization of Energy and the Ministry of Energy, Industry and Mining of Uruguay, the IDB, and the First Forum of Investments of Irina, we welcome you to this 8th Energy Week. It's an honor as an institution to be able to have your organization's representatives and means of communication that are participating today in the city of Montevideo. I want to thank the communications team of the Ministry of Energy and Mining of Uruguay, all the media that have participated today, our media partners, our sponsors, and all of our institutional support. We especially want to thank the collaboration of everyone who has made possible this 8th Energy Week, and thank our Executive Secretary, Andrés Rebolledo, who has had this initiative for the development of the communication panel, which aims to strengthen our bonds through effective communication, which will allow to unite the region with the discourse of communication united by energy. We will begin now. I want to invite our moderator, Nicola Gandini, please. Nicola Gandini. Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, André, Josefa, Gabriela. Honestly, I think that we have an advantage and a disadvantage being the last day of the event. We have heard a week's discussion of lots of issues that don't have yet clear or agreed solutions yet, and it's certainly an area of analysis and discussion. And one of the areas that needs to be discussed is communication. I say this as a journalist. I direct a network in Argentina that is really there for energy coverage. And when we try to talk about how to be more robust when disseminating an energy transition agenda, talk to a broader audience, a younger audience that is not necessarily related to the energy area, it's hard to find a specific answer. We have to appeal to new contributions, new platforms, new communicators. There is a mix between journalism, communication, influencers, streaming. There's a whole set of things that are being done right now. And so we have the huge challenge of being able to find effective ways of disseminating the agenda for transition that is coming and to find a fair transition agenda for each country. So without further ado, I'm going to present each of the speakers. Josefa was just saying it. We have Fitzgerald Canteno Piani, who has a degree in political science with a postgraduate degree in political science and a master's in advanced project management and administration. He's also an expert in political and institutional communication, holds a postgraduate degree in marketing management and an international certificate in change management. In the public sector since 2020, he has served as the National Director of Energy. He has previously worked as a department councillor, national representative, and a director of the State Insurance Bank. So Fitzgerald, please. Also from the Ministry of Energy and Mining, we have Maria Jose Silva Dominguez. She holds a degree in communication and a master's degree in corporate communication management. She has specializations in social media management in organizations, communication for change management, and communication for public policy. Since 2019, she has been working as a communication advisor for the National Directorate of Energy. Previously, she worked as a communication advisor at the National Directorate of Customs and the National Directorate of the Environment. She has also undertaken various communication consultancy projects for different national and international companies and organizations. So Maria Jose. On streaming, unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us. We have Gaston Fenez. He is a journalist and Argentine entrepreneur specializing in electric mobility and clean energy. He's the founder of 2 newspapers reporting on industry trends in Latin America and Spain, named Portal Movilidad and Energía Estratégica. He actively promotes sustainable mobility and renewable energy, organizing events and networking activities in the region. Additionally, he is the author of the documentary Pido Disculpas, produced in Glasgow in 2021, which analyzes the role of electric mobility and clean energy within the Conference of the Parties, COP. In 2015, he was awarded for his honest, independent work by the Honorable Chamber of Deputies of Argentina. He's one of the pioneers in dissemination of communication of the agenda of renewables, and therefore also after the transition. You will see it in the agenda. We had Ana Maria Núñez Elasha, who's responsible for a sector of the IDB, but unfortunately she can't be with us in person. So we have Gabriela Montes de Oca, who is a consultant of communication of the Division of Energy of the IDB. She has been working for 10 years in diverse areas of communications and specializing in topics related to technical aspects and gender aspects. She worked before leading the communication for diverse clients among technology, education, consumption, cybersecurity sectors in Latin America and the United States. She has a degree from the University of Andrés in Caracas, Venezuela, and also has a degree from the University of Georgetown. And lastly, last but not least, we have Horacio Acuña Barra. He is a graduate journalist from the University Bernardo O'Higgins with over 2 decades of professional experience, dedicating 15 years to technical and environmental journalism. Before joining Electricidad, which is a reference media in Chile, he worked at Indoambiente, a Chilean magazine specializing in industrial decontamination, energy resources, and sustainability. Throughout his career, he has also worked in the field of communication, consulting, and advisory, providing services to engineering consulting firms specializing in areas such as risk management and integrity of industrial facilities. In October 2022, he assumed the role of editor at Electricidad, a magazine with over 30 years of experience dedicated to addressing various topics related to the electric industry and the energy sector in general. So, Horacio. Can you hear me? Well, Horacio, we introduced you last, but we're going to have you open the panel. Let's just wait until we all have a seat. I was just saying in the introduction that it's hard to find a roadmap that is agreed on. There's no manual that explains how to effectively communicate in a robust way, in an efficient way, a transition agenda. Perhaps going over the endogamic circle that it means to sometimes talk to audiences that are already linked to the energy agenda. So how do you think about this being a reference media in Chile? What do you think about this approach? Would you try to find new sources, stakeholders to communicate? How are you analyzing this? Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, Olade. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And the question is quite broad, right? How are we approaching this? In the case of Chile, in this moment, the transition, an important element, or that we place a lot of importance on, is, on the one hand, generation. That's very important because in the last 10 years, renewable generation has had a significant increase and that has been sustained. And so that is one thing. And another thing that is also quite present in the media, and we cover it, and other specialized media do it as well, and also in a smaller degree, the press at large, is transmission, in the sense that one of the bottlenecks in the case of Chile is precisely the lack of a more robust transmission infrastructure that can evacuate the energy that is being produced in the centers of production when we're talking about renewables. So I could say that a big part of the coverage regarding production related to information on generation new projects. And another thing that I should say is that when we review the interactions, the clicks, the likes, all those ways in which the audience can manifest an interaction, information related to projects have a lot of outreach. So new projects for renewables, 100 megas, 200 megas, all of that creates quite a bit of interaction. So users who share the information. And also, in a smaller measure, the transmission. So transmission and distribution are relevant topics. There's also a reform, a bill that is being worked on in Congress for a decade that has to start to be worked on again. But if we talk about more massive subjects regarding the closeness, the perception that the general audience has, that's the main thing, generation. But since we are dedicated to energy at large, we cover information on the 3 segments. And also technological solutions that refer to energy and new technologies such as hydrogen, etc. Okay, Fitzgerald, I'm interested in asking you and Maria Jose as well from the communication standpoint. When you think about the design of a public policy in order to show the citizenship the importance of incorporating behaviors that have to do with a transition agenda, and I include within that a sustainable consumption or a policy of energy efficiency. How do you think about this today, and how can you try to have that campaign be as effective as possible and reach as many people as possible? How do you think about that in the General Directorate of Energy? Thank you very much, Nicolas, for the question. Thank you, Oleade, for the invitation. Hello to Gabriela Jarrin, Maria Josefa Corral, who have worked a lot during this time in order to have this great event. And this is a topic that is very important. Hello, Gaston. I don't know if he's hearing us. It's a pity that you're in Madrid and not in Montevideo, Gaston. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pity, but it is a vital topic among all the topics that you need to have on the table, the tools that you need to have in order to elaborate a policy. Communication is central because, as you said, Nicolas, when designing policies, it has to reach the ones you want it to reach. And so if it's something specific, like the case of a labeling campaign, or if it's something that's very specific for a certain sector, for example, a campaign for small and medium-sized businesses, your objective, your target audience has to know about this. And it's also about sometimes translating quite complex definitions to people. And so we sometimes talk about our campaigns, for our public policies in the design. That has to be very present when you start to create those policies as well. So a central thing is that that policy that is being developed has to be as easy as possible for the people. For communicators, that really helps them to see how people are going to adhere to the plan, how they're going to be able to comply with the policy. And so there is a process of taking away some of the bureaucracy, which is not simple, but with committed technical teams and with that objective can be achieved. That is an essential point. Another essential thing is how can we have the technical language, the work of our engineers. I don't want them to get mad at me, but all of this that you are explaining, now we have to communicate it to the people. The lady who is at home watching TV has to understand it. Mr. who is in the back, and so they say, okay, there is an energy efficiency measure that can help me in my job, in my life. And so we have to explain how these things can be replicated in the territory. That's when communication comes in and how to create that design. For us, it's fundamental to be able to be in touch with all journalists. It's very important for all the journalists of the country to know what are our tools, our proposals, and for them to help us communicate. It's of no use to have the best plans, the best laws and regulations and planning if afterwards we are not able to reach the public. If we cannot convey clearly what we are offering, and we've had all sorts of examples, Maria Jose is probably going to set some examples, but we have all sorts of examples, campaigns where a single press conference made the population come really quickly to ask or enroll, and there's others that are much harder. And of course, communicators will probably know why that happened. So that's sort of a first comment. I hope it's useful. Thank you very much, Maria Jose. Thank you, Nicolas Fitzgerald, and again, thank you, Olade, for inviting us today. So to complement what the director said, I think that it's important for communication to be a part of public policy since the inception. Communication should be seen as transversal, and when you create a base to launch something, we should think about the people who are going to read it. So the whole process, not just to have communication come in when it's ready, but for communication to take into account each of the parts, each of the parties, to be in the meetings, and not just think about the final audience. And then when communicating to the public, and journalism and communication media also have to find this interesting. And the idea is to take it to examples, have real cases, and have the stakeholders communicate success cases. Some days ago, we had the third forum of electrical mobility. It was a very important forum where many stakeholders and politicians and policymakers came to talk. And we had a small panel where we brought beneficiaries. And so a taxi driver, a cab driver sat down, an app driver sat down, and he said, okay, I spent 15,000 pesos in gas, and now I spent 1,000 in electricity. That's it. That was shown in lots of national media. It was replicated, and I think that's the path. This is a very specific example, but the director can say this, the minister can say this, the technicians can say this, but those who use it, saying it, and trying to generate those moments in the agenda, not try to just be published just because, but think about what's going on in the country right now. Is it winter? Well, then let's talk about how to be more efficient with heating. Is it summer? So try to find a way to position ourselves and position our topic, how to set examples, not just say this is no longer consuming. So how many homes does that represent? Is it a neighborhood? Is it a department? 2, 3? So try to bring that information down to earth. And I think that that is sort of what hooks you and makes you say, this energy thing affects me. I can do something at home. There's behaviors that I can change. How is that process like in the ministry, that discussion process? Because if we had had the same seminary 10 years ago, maybe the routine would be the directorate generates a public policy, you enter at the end of the process, you publish it in newspapers, of course, on paper, and that is published next day as an article. you are talking about a case where you included a creative element, which is you brought two people, a cab driver, someone who drives for an app, and you have them tell about a specific case. So how does that work? How do you create that? Well, we do it all the time. That's what we had to think about the most. The policies are generated, they are there to be applied, and the idea is precisely that, to be all the time trying to find ways to approach this. We try to have, for example, breakfasts between journalists and the director, where they can come and be informed. We try to talk about those policies with a prize. We have, for example, children speak. Children who were developing and working on policies of energy efficiency, to have the beneficiaries talk, to find those examples and find the most appropriate places to convey this. Apart from written media, you talked about the press gazette, but it's the same as with social media. We can't publish the same thing on Facebook, Twitter, the website of the ministry, Instagram. So we have to find those strategies and generate differential content that is specific for each place, and the same with each journalist. It's not the same to have a specific journalist or a general journalist that has to be hooked from another place. And the challenge here is that not just journalists who provide coverage for energy should cover this. We have to find a way for all the others to be interested and to find the way to also disseminate this information. That's very interesting, because you'll start to perceive that what is at play here is the category of means of communication. I'm saying this as a journalist. We had a position of comfort saying we are a link in the chain that communicates. But nowadays, anyone with a phone here, probably the average use is 4 or 5 hours, 6 hours of mobile phone use, and we are using multiple applications where we are communicating all the time, and taking advantage of that power is really complicated nowadays. Before we have Gabriela, I'm very interested in the IDB position, but I want to talk to Gaston. He is the alma mater of two very important media in Argentina. He really focused on renewables when very few people believed in that, and it is now a sector that has a lot of resilience, that is continuing to grow, even if the country has issues with financing and other things that you know better than I do. And then in the Latin American projection, I think that you have to study what he did to see how he had the success that he had. So if you want to share your story, Gaston, and say how to determine which content should be more visible, what shouldn't, that's very interesting. Well, I'm really happy. You know that I admire you a lot, and so thank you very much. Hello to all the Olade team. Thank you for the invitation. Gabriela Jardín, Maria José, Andrés Rogelio, all of the colleagues of the panel. Thank you very much. I wasn't able to be there in person this time. Perhaps if next year I'm invited again, we could do it in person. I would love that. So, going to your question, Nicolas. In Argentina, we covered the renewables sector, which has the particular aspect of being a very dynamic sector. The agenda is changing day to day because there's new technologies that are created. Nowadays, for example, some interesting topics have to do with storage or green hydrogen, not just with wind or solar energy and other renewables such as hydroelectrical, but also these technologies are new, so we don't know so much about them, and new projects start to appear. I think that we're going to see fewer projects which are just for wind or just for solar. I think that we're going to see hybrid projects that need storage, that also involve hydrogen. That's what we are seeing in terms of the tools that we have today, also in order to get to know the audiences that we have. So from Google Analytics up to the reports to see how each social media works. And I think that's a lot of the feedback regarding the content that generates an interest and the one that doesn't generate as much interest. And so that's how we try to approach the journalist agenda each week. You asked about how those media were generated, and we tried to place ourselves in Argentina in a really strong way. The company is Argentina, that's the way that we started. Then we were able to start growing and expand to other countries, covering Uruguay, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Dominican Republic, those countries that we are more focused on. We cover some of the most important news for some. And nowadays we have a team for strategic energy. So we have a lot of team management, organizing, the journalistic side, but also marketing side. We really value social media. We understand that there is more and more importance now in how to distribute content. Before, perhaps there weren't as many channels. You just publish the news, and users were used to going to the website, or that was sort of the way to generate their interest. Nowadays, as you said, people use their cell phones for 4, 5, 6 hours a day, and so we understand that we can't wait for users to come to us. We have to go to the users and tell them about the news of what's going on. So Instagram, LinkedIn for us is one of our main distribution channels. That's something that we've really focused on. And now we are also beginning with streaming, which is something that we find to be very fun, and having live interviews, generating that type of content. Taking advantage of the new social media is the most interesting thing. Regarding the agenda, we try to see what works with Google Analytics and in social media, and based on that we see where there is a bigger interest. There are topics that are repeated, there's topics that always generate an interest. If there is a new tender, if there is a project that is successful in the region, those are topics that in general are standout and are viewed a lot. But we also try to find a way to share the experiences of the different countries. Sometimes interesting news for Argentina are also interesting for Colombia or for Mexico. Mexico is in a very international place. It's very interconnected, and so our strategy is to try to relate the industry of Latin America. That's sort of the summary. I don't want to talk too much about it, but that's what we're working on. Okay, one last thing, and then we'll continue with Gabriela. Is it worth creating a field for transition? Because the whole field of renewables, mobility, it's super broad, but would it really be convenient to have a transition field in order for all of us to be aware of the importance of that and get on board that agenda at the speed that we can, but saying, okay, the world is transitioning, each country is going to see how to transition with which resources and elements, how to have a fair transition for the country. Is it worth creating an agenda for the audience to be identified with that? I think that we are on that path inevitably, the same as the governments are treading that path. In Spain, for example, you have the Ministry of Ecological Transition. In lots of countries, you have one for energy transition. So you start to see how transport and energy are joining. We used to see them as supply and demand, and now you have that all together. And I think that the media is going to inevitably communicate and have an agenda that has to do with the energy transition in all senses. Now, for example, all companies are called energy companies. The way to introduce themselves is no longer oil, it's energy, and so I think that they're all going the same direction. So even oil companies are now working on the generation of renewables. So these are transversal topics that are being touched on, and without doubt the journalistic agenda is going to go in that direction more and more. I think that there will be a point where it will be very hard to separate it different specializations like fossil and renewables. I think that we will just talk about energy transition. I don't know if that was the question. Yes, that was exactly the question. Gabriela, I don't know if you want to continue with what Gaston was saying and tell us how you as a multilateral organization think about the communication agenda linked to transitions. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation for the panel. I would like to welcome my colleague Ana Maria Núñez, who works really close to me in terms of infrastructure. The most important thing that we have to consider is that since the IDB is a multilateral organization, a development bank, financing bank, we work in a very different way from the traditional media or the government. Of course, the presentations here have been excellent. I feel very identified. So I would first like to have Ana Maria to say some things, and then I will complete that information. Thank you very much, Gabi. I don't know if you can hear me. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity of being here. As Gabi said, I am Ana Maria Núñez. I work with her. She is the one who is leading energy, and I'm working on infrastructure in general. I should just say two things, or three, before we continue with Gabi, for her to provide more details. The first thing is that for us at the bank, working with energy and transitions is within the logic of how we work with infrastructure. And the goal is to be able to provide services of sustainable infrastructure that are inclusive and universal in Latin America and the Caribbean. I should say that the first project of the bank was an infrastructure project, and so it's really in the DNA of the institution. Something that was also mentioned by the other panelists is that all this is part of an effort that is done that is going to involve several stakeholders in different moments of the chain of production. And going back to my first point, for us, it's part of a long-term effort. And third, something that was already mentioned in the panel is that all of our projects are focused on improving lives in Latin America and the Caribbean, improving people's lives. And so we are in this business of communication, and we have to communicate to people, and we have to remember that when we create strategies, messages, when we post content online. And so without further ado, I'll just have Gabriela take the floor again, and thank you very much for having me with you, even if it's not in person. Thank you, Ana. So to complete what Ana Maria has said, in my particular case, it's been a huge challenge because I'm not an engineer. And as the director said, it's very interesting to see how the synergy between communicator and engineers and specialists, who are the people who are doing the job and work with those topics. I'm not ashamed to say that when we talk about megawatts or installed capacity, it's not something that I really understand. But this is what enables me to say, okay, the people, everyday people, the lives that we are improving with our projects also don't understand about that. And as Maria Jose said, it's important to translate and talk in a language that can be understood, because we don't just appeal for the job of our specialists to be understood and have an impact. The IDB works a lot with different publications and content that is very valuable and that has a lot of impact in public policies that are created in Latin America and the Caribbean. But in the end of the day, if we can't translate that content and we can reach people, the lives of people that we are trying to improve, it's not worth anything. And so I think that's one of the main guidelines when working with communication. We have this technical content that can be hard to digest, and so how can we make it more understandable? And also taking something that Maria Jose said, I think that an invitation to these specialists, engineers, technicians, is to be serious about information. I think that sometimes communication is seen as a secondary thing, that it's not provided enough budget or attention or consideration, but without us, the job is just left at a very limited number of people and doesn't reach the people that it should be reaching. So if you allow me, I would like to share a very short campaign that we carried out in the IDB in order to communicate something that was very important. It was resilience in the Caribbean. As you know, energy resilience in the Caribbean is very hard because it's the region that is most affected by climate change. We prepared this super short video, but which I think really illustrates this topic of trying to translate this important work. And it is the content that we think applies both for the general public and for the authorities of the state, because this was produced for a meeting of authorities and main responsibles for energy in the Caribbean. So if you can show the video. Quiero contarles algo que es muy importante para mí, para todos nosotros en realidad. Es algo... Tenemos que jugar, bailar, soñar. Sin ello, nuestras vidas son muy difíciles y a veces no las tenemos. Así que por eso te necesitamos a ti. En el Caribe enfrentamos muchos desafíos energéticos. Tenemos huracanes, terremotos que nos dejan sin electricidad. Dependemos de las importaciones de petróleo y son caras. Hay que resolver esto, tienen que resolver esto rápido. Tiene que pensar en nuestro futuro.
Invest. Our energy needs to be resilient and diverse. Everyone must have access whenever they need it. Now is the time to come up with solutions. Together we have come a long way. We have put solar panels on top of buildings, street lights that are more efficient, electric cars and buses that are very cool. And look what we did to bring electricity to our village. But there's still much to do. Imagine what we can achieve together. For her, for him, for all of us, really. We're counting on you.
Entonces, bueno, ese es como uno.
So that is an example of a video that has a lot of production, of course, but we had the task of seeing, okay, we have this challenge, how can we work with this? How can we produce material that we can really use for different functions? And the resource of children, of course, is always something that really speaks to us, and to talk about the vision for the future, that sort of message really connects people and has more impact. So that is an example of what we try to do in the IDB. That's super interesting. It really makes us ask lots of questions. When in the Directorate of Energy, you have to think about which aspects of the transition to communicate or where to focus in order to design or manage a public policy. What's the approach of the ministry here in Uruguay? And I would also like to have a reflection about the regional level, because each country has its particular aspects. There's countries in Latin America with very different resources, where economies depend on very different resources. So how do you think that we could find an agenda taking into account the particular aspects of each? Well, thank you for the question, because it allows me to talk about a second point. In the first round, we talked about the fact that communication is very important when conveying policies, and seeing how to reach people, how people can understand us, how to make ourselves understood. That's sort of a headline for the first comment. Now, this second round allows me to set some examples of a fundamental concept which we have to have in the governments, which is energy transitions. And I'm talking about Uruguay and the region. I think that your question is very good. we have the concept of social license. When governments design certain policies, and specifically policies that are going to impact the territory, there's positive aspects, but there's also negative ones. I think that most of us here know that even if we tend all countries to include renewables, we know that there are groups and communities that manifest against these negative effects that the installation could have there. So it's very important, this concept of social license. Governments should incorporate in the agenda this item as a very important item, and for that item to be developed and to be able to have that social license, that it has to be provided by the community. Communication is the key. It is the means, the way. There's lots of examples, millions of examples. I think that perhaps the most current thing, what we talk about all the time, is hydrogen. And with these green hydrogen projects that we are trying to incorporate in the region, the point that is perhaps the most sensitive point is what's going to be the use of water, how much water is going to be used, how are you going to reuse that, etc. And that requires communication, a very important communication work with the community, with other important aspects as well. So the technical work, scientific work, comparisons, information, the tests of how that water is going to be used, what volume of water is going to be used in comparison with other production processes. And so we have to convey all that information to the population to be able to clear up doubts. And this is also very helpful for policymakers, because these are doubts that you have when you design any sort of policy. So that's the work and the job of communication there. Public audiences becomes very important, and this is also important at the regional level. In the region, in this very fruitful week, we had some bilateral meetings, and we've talked about this with some countries. This type of approach of trying to find that social license in common topics, for example, hydrogen, which is a trend, and it is in the first place, should lead us to common strategies and should lead the countries to do things together. And technology nowadays, we have two colleagues who are in another part of the world, and we are talking as if we were in the same living room. And so this allows us to have lots of meetings of this sort in order to be able to provide awareness in topics that are of interest to the governments. And so the regional governments can say, okay, let's work on the what it implies to have the infrastructure for green hydrogen or sustainable hydrogen. Argentina says, let's not say green, let's say sustainable. So what are the weaknesses or barriers in your country? What are they in mind? And so we should work in the region together, inviting journalists and the community to listen, to participate, to ask questions. I think that that's the best way to obtain that concept of social license, which is not permanent. It's not that we say, okay, let's install a plant somewhere and everyone is happy because it will create jobs and people are very committed. Time goes by, maybe construction finished, there's fewer jobs, we still have the plant but with less people, so it's something that needs to be renewed all the time. And I think that's the other point. Communication is vital there as well, and there's opportunities to do that at a regional level and strengthen the strategies and specifically strengthen that relationship with the community, which needs to understand that those policies are of benefit for everyone. That's very interesting, Fitzgerald. So Maria Jose, perhaps you could talk about a specific thing, which is that when we talk about social license in Argentina, we have a recent case which was to try to have the social license in order to have a project of offshore exploitation that generated a whole analysis case in terms of communication and things that were done right and things that were done wrong. That's all very complex, and I want to ask how can you do that you said before, being since the inception of a public policy, and how do you take advantage of all the opportunities that digitalization provides now, which is a process that has been ongoing for several years, but I think that is something that still has potential that is not exploited as much still. And so how do you provide a voice to the stakeholders that are part of a public policy? How do you provide them with a voice in order to be able to get that social license? For example, maybe you have a project for electricity, and so you get a cab driver or someone else, and you have them tell the story. What is the potential for that in the future? Well, first of all, digitalization, social media. I think that we talked about this in the first question a bit, but if we go specifically to the topic, yes, I think that apart from that, as a government, as a state, we need to dare do more. I think that sometimes we were a bit late, or it was hard for us as a government to go into all the social media, to talk in Instagram, on LinkedIn, to answer, to have a back and forth, and to start what I was saying, which is communicating in a different way, communicating as a brand. We have to generate a brand. So energy efficiency is also a brand, it is a country brand, and so we have to rethink that and position ourselves that way, and think about where people are, where they go to look for information. We talked about mobility, but it happened recently with a campaign that was related to labeling, and so beyond locals, where do they buy? Where do they find out this information? Where do we have to have alliances? And so we had, for example, a strategic alliance with Mercado Libre, or for example with Google Apps, that when people put, for example, buy fridge, things like that, that we all do when we're going to buy something. First, perhaps before going to a shop, we go online, look for prices, compare. That's where we have to be. That's where we have to communicate. In the same way that the fridge brand communicates, we have to communicate it that way. I am providing very basic and specific examples, but because I have to follow what I said, which is that you have to set examples. But I think that that's the path, and that we have to be there, we have to be present more and more, and try to set those examples, look for them, go to the places. We are trying to have lots of projects in the interior of the country, and they say the interior of the country, but it's not enough. You have to go there, you have to have audiovisual content, you have to give them a voice, and for them to be able to tell. The school of the place has to go see the project, the teacher. You have to generate that a business that is carrying out similar activities goes and visit and generate those bonds, those connections, which are the ones that really make the communication reach the population, and for it not to be something that is isolated, for them to be really involved and to feel that they are in touch with us, that there is a point of contact. So there's that bureaucracy, as Fitzgerald said, of saying, oh, I have to call this number. No. Here you have my contact, here you have my WhatsApp. So we generate that bond, and we are really there. And that's super interesting. I think that it's an exercise that, of course, means overcoming a lot of resistance that you probably have. And for in the institutional level, it's always easier to do what you have done for a long time, and changing things requires internal work.
Pareció interesante porque ya
I think that's something interesting. Yesterday, in the team, we had some discussions, and we were saying, who are the people? We are also the people. You don't have to go as far as going to a community and getting to know them. We just have to think as well of how we are consuming information. What are we reading more, traditional media or digital media? As Maria Jose said, what is our train of thought when taking a measure on energy efficiency? Do we prefer an electrical vehicle instead of a gas vehicle. So we shouldn't just think that the people that we're talking to are outside. We should think about ourselves as well, not put ourselves in another person's shoes, but in our own shoes. If we are consuming more information on this, how am I acting? How is my organization acting to reach the people who are not just outside, but also within my own circle? I think that a key there could be empathy. In my professional practice and in the IDB, I think that we always try to have empathy and say, okay, this is my perspective, but I also have to take into account another person's perspective, and not just with a publicity aim. We also have the job of making our organizations show the impact that they have, and of course we have to sell the results, but it has to be authentic, which I think is very important. We don't have to take advantage of a situation. It's happened a lot that sometimes we go and provide coverage for a mission, and there's people who have interests who, due to their social, economical position, they need for that support not just to be for one moment for the cameras and that's it. They need that to be authentic and to have a real intention behind it in order to have the support that they need. I'm going to have Horacio and Gaston now, the journalist side of the panel. This is also something that I'm interested in as editors, as directors of means related to energy. We have the process of learning and training, and if you tell me, give me an engineer who worked in energy, I know that that person is going to be able to explain to the audience in a concrete way what he is communicating, because he has that expertise. But the current context also requires to undo that sort of search for very qualified people who can talk in a very technical language, but you have to maintain that technical audience. Of course, someone who reads you every day wants that to be expressed with the words, categories, and technical depth in order for it to be of interest to them, because if not, they won't read it. But the organization also has to find the way to communicate in a simpler way, in a more daily language, so that you can read 2 paragraphs of a article and continue reading it. So how can you explain a complex sector like electricity and at the same time find communicators in the same means in order to try to also reach people who are maybe in a more general approach, but it also has to do with our future? I don't know if you understood the question. So how we maintain the technical level of information, but also convey it in a more accessible way? I think that the more you dominate a discipline or a concept, you can express it in different ways. I don't know if the journalists here have had the experience, but in my case, when there is a complex thing, sometimes you say, I'm not going to paraphrase it, I'm just going to put it in between inverted commas so that I don't have issues with anyone. So I think that as journalists of the energy sector, I think that you have to have a position of being in continual training, because the content that we approach, there's 3 disciplines that are transversal for the content, and these are, on the one hand, engineering, electrical engineering, on the other hand, the legal and regulatory aspects, and third, the economic aspects and concepts. In the case of Chile, for example, the electricity fees. So those are the 3 elements. So I think that you have to have a disposition towards constant training in order to broaden the concepts, because in the past it was just talking about hydrogen. Now there's different things. You have SAF, which is linked to a certain degree, but it's not precisely hydrogen, but pure hydrogen cannot be stored, that's too expensive, and so there's a lot to learn and which come up daily. And so that's one thing. And on the other hand, we also have to be careful with temptation, let's say, that we are all exposed to, which is not to be in our comfort zones, in the sense that technology allows us today, it really helps with the journalist work, and sometimes you just make some corrections and you just publish it. And so I think that we should maintain, or try to maintain, I don't know if I should call it spirit or old practices of classical journalism, of saying, despite having these modern tools, we should still have that balance. I think that those two elements are a good formula in order to try to simplify and try to have a language that the broad audience can understand regarding energy. Okay, Gaston, do you want to complete this with... Yes, thank you, Nicolas. I think that it depends on the mission of each outlet. If you are focused on informing the industry, if you are focused on training the final user, what type of information we're going to generate and who we're going to be talking to, who is the user, the reader, the audience, in that sense, at least in terms of strategic energy, mobility, we are focused on being the voice of the industry. And so thinking about the content, if we think about flat content, that's also complicated because our audience is not very interested in that. If we publish an article of how to inject energy in the grid, it's what the sector knows about, and we wouldn't be, they wouldn't read it, and so we are focused on how to present it, the headline. Everything is directed towards a reader that is specialized, and we try to provide them with information that they don't know about. So that's the challenge every day, to try to provide information that they don't know. And so that's the sort of side of the sector that we're focused on. But we have some articles that are more for the end user, for everyday people. But perhaps in Instagram it would make more sense, perhaps on Facebook. We don't see it as much in LinkedIn. I think that we have to think about the content depending on the user. Sometimes you want to satisfy people with the content. We try to use specialized journalism, and we try to position ourselves that way. That is what we aim for. So that dichotomy of thinking of content for final users or our audience, that debate is something that we have solved some time ago, and we try to be a sectorial portal, understanding that perhaps in quantities it's not the same as a general outlet that could have a broader audience, but we know who our readers are, and that's what we focus on. It's a very segmented audience, and that of course means training of the team. You have to train yourself, you have to have talks every week, explain how to work on each article, what each topic means, how to approach the interviews. The editorial aspect also has to be worked on. We cannot make mistakes there because readers know what we're talking about and knows more than we do. You also have to be humble and admit that an engineer in the sector, of course, knows much more. I'm not going to explain, Fitzgerald, how the energy sector works, but I can explain if there is a new project, a new trend, an opinion of someone in the sector that could be interesting for him. So our perspective is to focus on a sectorial portal that can afterwards, maybe in the future, be expanded to a more general audience. Thank you for that answer. It also allows us to talk a bit about our perspective. With the Economic Journal, we did it with the fact that big outlets that were transitioning from paper to digital, we knew that that process was not going to be easy. It was going to be painful in the sense that it was going to be very hard for big media, paper media, to be able to transfer their accumulation in paper to the digital world in a short time, and that was going to allow digital media that could be born genuinely as digital. We could have the opportunity of competing for information. If you created a good journalism team, since the big media were going to have an internal battle, you could position yourself as a place of reference and with a good reputation. I think that there's cases in Latin America where they have done that. The thing is, one of the points of this event, which I hope is one of many, is how can specialized outlets contribute to the dissemination of an agenda that we have to do right now, because now is the time. And I have the same dilemma as you, Gaston, because if we are in a growth period of adding journalists, of training them, when we find a journalist and you say it's dedicated to energy, it's not that everyone comes running to work with us. It's complex, and so if in that process at the same time you have to try and generate other communication strategies, more general, that have another objective, the thing is that you lose a bit of your identity. What happens is that your audience, well, some years ago we did something because Argentina for some years hasn't been able to have a fee for gas and energy that really reflects the real costs. The truth is that the electricity and natural gas fee for 20 years hasn't reflected even half of the cost. And so we said, okay, let's hire 2 influencers, Instagram and YouTube, one of each ideology. One was more center-left and the other one was more centered. And they had to explain this, and so they both understood that it would make sense to have that subsidy. And so we had that campaign of those 2 influencers that were very serious and professional. But when we saw how that action had been perceived, people didn't really like it. They said, you are not this. Why do you bring in someone who is talking with another aesthetic, with another platform? So we like to have this sort of initiative, but what I mean is it's not simple to find what to communicate in each platform. So on Instagram, we can maybe play and be a bit more playful with how we communicate. In LinkedIn, no, we have to be more precise. And so that job is something that is going to require time, and it's going to require for the whole environment to help us think. We don't have the answers. We have to see how collective actions can be the response. Can I add something, Nicolas? So, in line with that, it's more challenging with the media because we depend a lot on new technology, so social media, and we are growing, and I myself am not an Instagram user. I don't use it at a personal level. And so that implies counting on people who understand it, who use it, and that means younger people. In the past, experience was valued more, but nowadays we see that after a certain age, it's hard to adapt to new technologies sometimes, and so also in order to understand audiences better and Nicolas can talk about this for hours, but we have to understand that it's a business and it has to work, and there is a commercial business model that also leads to having activities that are maybe sometimes more commercial than journalistic in order to maintain the outlet. And so sometimes you can have activities that could be publicity, and also the model of the company has to be linked to that. It's hard to, it's very difficult to maintain that romantic view of journalism, not have any sponsors. So we have to try to have the best content possible, to be able to have all that information, but at the same time grow, adapt to new technologies. It's really a daily challenge. And when you think about what type of outlet you want to generate, it has to do with rethinking that scheme. What we see nowadays in general terms is a fall of the outlets in general in terms of budget. There's lots of advertising tools, and for example, you have influencers advertising on Instagram, Facebook, so it's no longer radio, TV. There's a whole set of possibilities, and if you are smart and creative, if you're not smart and creative, it's hard to get financing, and so you have to try to update yourself and understand new technologies in order to generate the best content and adapt it to the needs of the audience. It's a difficult time for the media, because you have to be very active, take a look at the trends of not just what's happening in your country, but also in other places that is inevitably going to reach you as well. So I think that that's something that we need to talk about as well. Anyone wants to continue with what Gaston was saying? Gabi? Yes, I think that energy in particular is also a very changing market. As I said, there are sometimes projects that are hybrid, others that are solar, and at some point it will all be part of the same thing, because that's the evolution of technologies. And I think that we could fight against that, or be in denial and say, okay, I need to adapt my communications again and hire someone, or we can make use of what we have in order to take advantage of that and adapt. And I think that you always have the opportunity of doing something that it doesn't have to be that elaborate, but which allows you to be in line with what's going on and with what the people want to understand better, and which is affecting them in their daily lives. So what is the structure of the IDB in that sense? How do you think about communication with this whole set of possibilities of social media, audiovisual? You just showed a video that really touches you. I was in Punta Cana about 6 or 7 months ago visiting an island which now has the project of batteries with photovoltaic, and I remember that real quick. And you have that agenda there, but how do you think about this when in a world where communicating is very different from 10 years ago? 10 years ago you had a good journalist in radio, television, different economic means, so specialized journalists, 2 or 3, and you have a coverage. And Maria Jose just said that now you have to rethink everything. If you want to have a social license, you have to be really involved. And how do you think about this? I think that the IDB really takes into account the diversity of people. We cannot use simple things as a stock picture where just white people appear, or just men, for example. We always try to have our communication be diverse. The video that we showed you, it wouldn't make sense to film it somewhere where you only have white actors. I think that that's very basic, but you have to take that into account in a world where people nowadays have more social awareness, environmental awareness. I think that's key. And the second thing, as I said in the beginning, the IDB produces a lot of knowledge, and we always have this thing, this technical thing of maybe discharge is not being what we want. And we are using a lot of social media and segmentation in order to have our content reach many people. I think that otherwise it would mean losing a lot of energy. And with the IDB being an organization that works with water, education, lots of things, the use of those tools is very important. And the IDB is a bank, it's an institution. But I think that my piece of advice for people is that if you have a budget, see if it makes sense, if it's worth it to continue with more traditional press, or maybe if you should invest that in platforms as the ones that you already know. I'm not going to mention them, but using those tools, because unfortunately, due to the whole debate on data that we have, but they are very effective. And something that we said yesterday is that with the use of influencers, it's also good to measure the risk. These campaigns can sometimes also spin out of control, and you have to have the whole scene mapped in order to know what's going to be their reaction, if it could be positive or negative, and how to work with these people that could provide a bigger audience but have those risks and consequences. Yes, just something brief because we are almost finishing. I hope that this is a challenge for communicators, journalists that are here, and all of you. I was talking with a communicator from an energy company from Central America the other day, and she said, we have the advantage of people believing what we say. People believe what the TV says, and it's true. I would add Facebook, and I have my mother, for example, who is always talking about things that she sees on Facebook. I can't talk about most of them here, but I can talk about something. So she said, I saw that you're going to be in Florida on Friday. Yes, I read on Facebook that you're going to be in Florida on Friday. And I say, no, that's not true. And she said, yes, because it's on Facebook. So people read it, and it's already the truth for them. And so that, which is an advantage, ends up being a huge responsibility. So what you're saying about the media, the specialized outlets such as yourselves, it is a big challenge. How to communicate, how to translate technical language, how we do it, and also the fact that what I'm saying is really so, because behind this we have the other concept of the fact that communication is teaches what we say, what we communicate is creating an opinion. It is going to a population that say, okay, this person said this and that, I'll go and repeat it, or if I don't like this, maybe I think that it's crazy, and perhaps that was actually true. And so there is a huge responsibility to not lose sight of that. Communication has that fundamental role of creating opinions, of teaching, and so therefore we should be careful with what we say and be responsible. I would like to ask you something else regarding that. You mentioned the case of your mom and talked about the efficiency of social media in the sense that people easily believe what is spread there. So that is an advantage given the power of the media, but it's also a disadvantage because it allows to spread fake news. So when we talk about this bridge between energy and the environment, in countries like, for example, Argentina, where you say, okay, you have vaca muerta, you could double the production of oil in the coming years, that implies going against the current, because not everyone believes, lots of people believe that decarbonization means less oil production. And Argentina could say, we have a lot of poverty, we could have this as an opportunity. And when you go to the environmental discussion and the bridge between energy and the environment, it's very complicated to control the conversation in social media, for example. How do you see that as policymakers? Well, we could spend 2 hours talking about that because that is a really fascinating topic. What we should see is what are the priorities. If you have 40% of the population in poverty, you are talking about poverty and energy poverty. So what is your first priority there? Your first priority is to eliminate that poverty, to be able to reduce as much as possible that poverty, and for people to be able to access energy in a safe way and to access energy of quality. Your second priority is going to be the environment, to be able to provide a quality product, but also for it to be sustainable. Sometimes it can be done and sometimes it can't. I think that energies, different types of energy, are going to continue co-living during many years, many decades. I think that what we can do is have a reduction of the contaminating sector and contaminating sources, but sometimes you can't eliminate them. We feel very proud of the fact that we have an electricity generation of almost 100%. But if there is a drought, like we've had at some points, you have to turn on the thermal central and you have to use gas oil for that, and that's very expensive. Or like when our Argentinian brothers sell us gas in order to generate it, that's a bit cheaper, but we have no choice. The other option is to leave the population without energy. And so when you have a menu of options and you see the different resources and what you have to do, you have to know that that has an impact and consequences. Now, when reality hits you, of course, that gets complicated. Maria Jose, would you like to talk about this as well? No, well, I think that we have been developing everything, the whole path of the public sector specifically. I was thinking about what Gabriela said of going beyond that, and when we generate something, a piece of communication, to have an impact beyond that and what we're going to generate. I think that this video that you showed is very good from that standpoint, but also daily with the policies that we generate, with the social media. You talked about influencers and what that can generate, and I say that sometimes that fear, that worry should not limit us. It shouldn't make us not do it. Sometimes that fear with these things that are very technical, you talked about engineers, but sometimes it happens to me that sometimes we're going to communicate something and those are not the words. You have to find the term, find the way to talk about different things. Sometimes you talk about a pure car, for example. Why does it say pure? What does that mean? And so we want to say something to the population, and perhaps we should not be afraid of using other kind of wording that is maybe not as precise. Maybe we have to put two or set an example, put a drawing, a graph, and an infograph. We are the ones who have to be creative and see how, but we have to do that. I understand that you have a very specific audience, but in our case, we have to reach all the population and communicate this. And so we have to try to find that way, that translation. I agree with Gabriela there. In the beginning I was like, wow, and we shouldn't be afraid in communication to ask again, find the way to do it, see what people buy at the supermarket. Is it really all LED? And so I think that we have a challenge that is super interesting there as well. So Horacio, to finish, any final comments? Well, due to what we talked about, I realized that in the end we are talking about messages to two audiences, so the general audience with the public entities, and in our case it's a more segmented one. But I think that in each case there are objectives that sometimes meet. When you were talking, I was thinking that in the case of Chile, for example, some generators, when they have a community project, and some specialized means they hire a journalists, and so perhaps that would be a way to maintain a specialized content, but for them to be the ones who tell about what they're doing in benefit of the community, for example. So perhaps communication could be joined in the future, referring energy transition. I think that platforms do meet in that sense. And as Maria Jose said, the most effective messages are the most simple messages. And so journalists have to take some elements of the advertising language and political communication as well, which sometimes are very simple messages in which to say it somehow go directly to the heart. Gaston, to finish? I would just like to make a comment regarding the importance of being aware of everything that has to do with innovation. For the means, it's sometimes difficult to adapt, specifically traditional means, traditional outlets. And sometimes the worry is about how to generate content and not so much about the distribution of content. And you can have the most important piece of news in the world, but if it doesn't reach people, it doesn't make sense. When we talk about distribution of content, there's a lot to study all the time regarding how algorithms change, how social media changes, how technology of communication changes all the time. And in that sense, I think that it's important to be up to date with streamings, with what is read, what is seen in each segment. I think that we are closer to an oral scheme and we are not reading as much. I think that we are moving in that direction, which is sort of more primitive, because in the past knowledge was transmitted orally, then we had the print, and I think that we are going back to audiovisual, and I think that we have to be aware of how to generate content. In the past, perhaps it's valuable to have a journalist who can be on camera, tell the story, so it changes all the time. So if we don't adapt, we are in risk, we have the risk of not being able to continue, and we always have to have the audience in mind. The advice that I would give to the ministries of energy is that oftentimes they have press communications that are sort of a hybrid. They are not for the general audience and they are not for the specific audience either. It's sort of in the middle. And when we get it, the specialized outlets, when we read it, we say the only thing that helps us from this is the 5th paragraph, for example. The rest doesn't contribute much, and it's difficult afterwards to disseminate it because you have to maybe rework it a lot in order for it to make sense. And that is also of no use for a generalist outlet as well, because it's also in the middle. There are some things that the general audience will not understand. Maybe they won't understand the scale of what is being mentioned. And so for ministries, since this is the Energy Week and I know that you are participating, think about communication. Maybe you can have a double communication, one for specific audiences and one for the general public. And I think that's going to work better. Just wanted to thank you. I really liked the debate. It's very interesting. A great hug for all my colleagues. If you make the mistake of inviting me again next year, I'll try to be there in person. Thank you very much, Nicolas, for the moderation. Thank you, Gaston. Gabi, to close. Wow, what a pressure. Independently from whether the people here are communicators or engineers or people from the government, I would like to say that you should take communicators into account and advisors as well. If you have the possibility of having that expertise in your team, it's going to really contribute a lot. I'm speaking for my colleagues and other professionals in the area. If you have an important message, but you are not able to have that message reach the population, then that message is lost. So see us as allies, as a partner who can help you make this energy transition, improve the lives of people, and have the support of those people so that the processes are easier, and in order to be able to transition to renewables in a faster way, because the region really needs it. Thank you, Gabi. This is the end then. Josefa says that we are over time. From me, just wanted to thank Olade. Let's hope that this is the first of many workshops. We have to think collectively. We have to be able to have this type of stimulus. I have a lot of ideas now. Of course, afterwards in your daily lives, you're not able to think about the important things, but thinking about how to communicate in the future, I think that for the outlets that provide coverage for the transition agenda, this goes beyond that, and it's about how to bring the energy sector to society in a moment where energy is vital and it's being discussed everywhere. You buy the newspaper and you see that there are energy discussions in the in the headlines. Unfortunately, there are things happening like wars and all that, but I think that in Latin America we should pay more attention to this. It's not given as much importance in the outlets, and this should not be so in the following years, because the things that are going to happen in the world mean that we should consider it important. Not just because we wanted to have more visibility, but because the world is changing. And if you are outside that transition, if you take a look at the statistics in Argentina and you take a look at the number of electrical vehicles, you realize the cost that that has. And thank you, everyone, and we'll be speaking shortly. Sorry, I forgot to include. Well, if there are questions, I see a raised hand over there. I don't know if there's a microphone.
Buenos días.
Good morning. It's not so much a question, it's more a comment or a very specific reflection. Obviously, the panel is very related, as the speakers said, to two versions, so an institutional, political one, and a sectorial one. But I would like to say something about that regarding political communication. Oftentimes, communication has an issue with the fact that sometimes there is not enough of a budget in order to be able to communicate it in the right way. Sometimes it is left aside. In the case of the sectorial communication, I see that there are conflicts of interest regarding what product is being communicated. We are talking about energy transitions, and we are not focusing on how we communicate or what is the conflict between a product of energy and another product of energy. For example, electrification versus natural gas. In my country, for example, in Peru, you have that sort of issue. Another topic that I saw is that there is an issue with communicators. We have a flaw because we don't use quantitative tools. Horacio mentioned it, engineering, economy, but we need for universities to teach us about that, because in the end, when we go out to the market, we don't know anything. Basically, those are the reflections that I wanted to share with you. In the case of when we talk about political communication, or the versions of how to say something, I think it would be good to talk about it in terms of how many people are benefited, how much coverage could be established. That could provide a better coverage, and also the budget. and all the stakeholders in the structure, so lawyers, the IT, all of them should also be aware that communication is important, because if it will just be communication for what the minister says, it doesn't make much sense. Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know if someone wants to say something or if there's any other comments. I think that there's a raised hand over there. Good morning. Great workshop. I agree that we have a lot of ideas now. I am an independent journalist in Uruguay. I'm not just focused on energy. I work with different topics. I'm an agronomist. I have a special program, but I have a more general program. I don't know if this happens to other colleagues, but I get a lot of information from important institutions that are not in the Uruguayan language. International organizations still use the language of the country where they are developed, and they don't adapt it to our language, or the language that, as you said, has to reach a massive audience. And sometimes there's huge communications I get here, but we can only use 2 or 3 sentences, and each time we have less time in order to read those long communications, and so it's hard. Secondly, we see lots of resources which are ill spent in communication. Sometimes we intervene in amazing events where you realize that there is a lot of investment, thousands of dollars. However, communication is not valued. There's events where it's not valued. We don't even have a press room, an adequate press room. In general, we don't even have one. I was participating in different events. I was in a beekeeping event, worldwide event in Chile. It was a huge event with more than 1,000 participants, and there was no press room. There was no support for the press. And this is fundamental. And it angers me because independent media, as our colleague in Spain said, we have a hard time sustaining the outlets. And when you request support from national or international organizations that spend a lot of money in trying to self-communicate or to have self-publicity, when you go and ask for very small support in order to continue functioning, it's always no, or most of the cases it's a no. They say there's no budget, it's not contemplated, and however, there are resources. Take a look at the publication that Olade did for this event. I have it here. I received it just now. So this publication, how much did it cost? Did you calculate the cost? But if you ask Olade for something like this, for media, for outlets that try to convey things, the answer is not positive. Right, so any more participations? I see 2 raised hands. We're going to have a last question and then we'll finish. Sometimes we talk about simplification as a solution. But how much are we working with the media, the IDB, and authorities in enriching language so that people can communicate better and to have this communication be more sophisticated? So instead of simplifying, how can we train new generations of professionals and communities so that they have a more complex language? Well, there's no single answer to your question. We were talking about the need sometimes to have a simpler message for certain audiences, and also the need to continue to educate audiences that need more elements and to which you can talk to in a more technical language. But this is a workshop. Of course, there's more to reflect on, but we are quite over time, so let's finish here. Thank you everyone for coming.